We're sitting down for an armchair session, so this really is going to be a dialogue, which is wonderful. And I've told other people here, but a lot of the work that we do in Canada as the Institute, we often hold a conference similar to this. And one of the things that's usually a feature in that conference is a session where we get to sit down with a former minister, our case, a deputy minister or a former permanent secretary or chief officer, as it's now dubbed. And it's a great opportunity. I really love these sessions because, one, it's a chance to be quite candid and frank. But it's also, to be quite candid, you can't find a lot of opportunities to actually understand the relationship between the political and the administrative or bureaucratic dynamic. Even if you, in the courses in school or other training programs, trying to get a course that's called political acuity, hard to find. Yet, it's such a critical component of the things that we actually do. It has a huge influence over all the things that we're trying to achieve collectively. So I know that will probably be true here as well. So if I could, I'm going to introduce one of our guests, and then Gloria's going to introduce the other. To my immediate left is Joy Basdeo. Hopefully I got that correct. Mrs. Basdeo joined the civil service as a teacher in January of 1974, and by 1982 had reached the ranks of Chief Education Officer. In 1988, she was promoted to Principal Secretary of Health and Social Services, and I know she's got a story about that. She returned to the Education Ministry from 1992 until her retirement in 2005. While serving as a permanent secretary, Mrs. Basdeo took on the role of Executive Director of Vision 2008, a broad-based country planning exercise which involved over 2,000 citizens. She was honored by the Queen Elizabeth II in 2001 with a Member of the British Empire Award, and for services to the Cayman Islands in the fields of education, country planning, and is a Justice of the Peace and a Notary Public. And I would just note too that today she's working with her husband Sam in the wedding business, which she's inherited from her parents. So welcome.
Thank you. And it is my pleasure. Are you able to hear me? Everyone in the back? Good? Perfect. So it's my pleasure today to introduce Mr. Roy Bodden. Now, Mr. Bodden is no stranger to public service. He has literally been at every side of the delivery of public service, starting within the civil service, moving on to politics, right up to a ministerial position, and then moving on again to public service, where he's currently the president of our local university, University College of the Cayman Islands. So literally a lifetime of public service. Now, Mr. Bodden will tell you he is first and foremost an educator, a cultural historian, and a visionary writer. He graduated with honors from University College of Jamaica, and in 1967 he returned home to become the first principal of East End Primary School. He subsequently went on to receive his bachelor's at Trent University in Ontario, Canada, so he's very familiar with the Canadians, and his master's in education from Queen's University, also in Ontario. Having completed these studies, he enrolled in the Graduate Studies program of the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs in Syracuse University, so moving a little further south. In 1988, he was elected to represent the District of Bodden Town in the Legislative Assembly, and he served 4 consecutive terms until 2005. He was the Minister of Education, Human Resources, and Culture from 2000 to 2005. In 2003, in recognition of his service in education and community affairs, a Doctor of Humanities was conferred upon him by the International College of the Cayman Islands, and in 2011, he received a Distinguished Alumni Award from Trent University. A patron of the Cayman Islands AIDS Foundation, Roy was appointed president of the University College of the Cayman Islands in October 2009 and has recently announced his retirement at the end of this year. Roy has written and published many articles and books on social, cultural, economic, and political evolution of the Cayman Islands. Too many to list them all, but notable works include Stories My Grandfather Never Told Me, a collection of Caymanian stories, Patronage, Personalities, and Party parties, Caymanian politics from 1950 to 2000, A Gathering of Old Men, a collection of stories from the guardhouse, and he's informed me that his latest book is about to come out in the spring of next year. So stay tuned. I understand there's going to be a very interesting book, further delving into the history of his favorite topics, culture and politics in the Cayman Islands. So we are so privileged to have you here. Thank you so much, Mr. Bodden.
So can we pose the first question, or did you guys?
Oh, we thought we would put a spin on this.
So just so you know, we actually had planned things, and true to form, our two guests are taking over the reins, and we like that.
We want to break the ice because over the course of the professional time I was in as a minister, Joy and I had such a wonderful relationship. We understood each other, and you too will understand and appreciate the humor in this, and understanding the rapport and respect with which we had for one another. So here I go. I, minister, take you, chief officer, to be my partner for the next 4 years. These things I promise you. I will form my own opinion of your strengths and weaknesses and give you a chance to show me that you can do a good job. I will respect you and be honest with you. I will weigh your advice carefully, even if I don't always agree. I will always have your back. Always be aware that we are a team. In the day-to-day running of our ministry, where I am the CEO, your role is to be my chief operating officer. And I will not interfere in or promote office politics or human resource decisions. I will do my best between us to be your confidant, listener, and critic. Therefore, I will always make time to talk to you one-on-one. Recognizing that you walk a difficult line between politics and the civil service, I will always show our ministry in the best light by being prepared and being professional. I will always try to be cheerful and make you laugh whenever you're feeling down.
I think every chief officer in the room just said, I do.
Okay. I, Chief Officer, take you, Honorable Minister, to be my partner for the next 4 years. And these things I promise you. I will be loyal to you and honest with you. I will respect, trust, help, and care for you. At least I'll try very hard to care for you as another human being doing a tough job. I pledge my best effort in the work we undertake together, when the going is easy and when it is hard. I will keep your confidence and give you my best advice at all times. If I am unable to carry out a specific request you make of me, I will tell you, including the reason why. I will do my best between us to be your confidant, listener, and critic. I will ensure that your policies are conveyed to the public and always strive to make you look good and be your biggest fan. I will ensure that the office environment we work in is calm and peaceful, an oasis you look forward to entering, and that you are not interrupted by office politics. I will find the ways to make you laugh when you are down and celebrate when you accomplish your plans. The coffee, tea, or Milo will always be fresh and hot. I really think everybody who knows that I have done 2,500 weddings know where that comes from. But I think that really shows you and sets the scene for the relationship that the Honorable Minister and I were fortunate enough to have. Over to you.
I think one of the things that made our relationship so unique is when I came to office very early, I called my chief officer and I said, now, here's what I'd like to establish. I'm a politician, you're a career civil servant. I'm not after your career, and you certainly don't want this job. So here's what I expect of you. I want you really to put me on the right track. The things I want to do, can they be done? If they can be done, how they can be done, give me. And I promise you, I will stay out of the office affairs. And I did that. And for 4 years plus, we had a great relationship in spite of all the political pressures. I can say this, when I went to caucus and all of my colleagues were complaining about their chief officers, I sat mum and they would have to prod me and say, what is your experience? I said, well, because I didn't want to say how things were rosy in my situation. I didn't want, but I heard them complaining and cursing, and I never had those situations at all. I never had those situations at all.
Wow.
So I'm curious, so you've given a good introduction to sort of that relationship you had. Maybe you can just, as I say, some of this, the people to see from afar, right? And so they're curious about that relationship, so between the political and the bureaucratic, the administration. How would you describe it? Like, where's the distinction? So you've talked about somewhat of your roles, but what is the difference between the two? You know, where are you heading? What are you trying to do? Maybe you start with this.
Well, maybe as far as I'm concerned, the thing is the buck stopped with him. I always had the supporting role. And I have always felt, I think things are probably different now, but I have always felt like the Canadians have the permanent secretary is called the deputy minister, and I always looked at my role as his deputy. My job was to support him, promote what he was doing. That was it. That was always but in the final analysis, the buck stopped with him. He was the one that had to answer to the people.
And I felt so confident with that relationship that in some instances, I surrendered to my chief officer's leadership because I didn't see it as a rivalry. I said, here, I'm here for 4 years. What I have to do as a politician, as a career politician, is come out of this 4 years looking the best that I can look. So if at times I let my chief officer lead, hey, that's par for the course as far as I'm concerned. But I realized also that ultimately I had the responsibility, but we never had a clash as to who was the authority in the ministry. I knew what my chief officer's role was and what her responsibilities were, and she knew what mine were. And sometimes we had to confer and hold consultations, but rare is the time when there was discord and disagreement between us.
So I'm just curious, I'm going to follow up a little bit further, and I think I know the answer to this, but when we talk about the long-term public good, where does that rest? Right, you see, so you have a 4-year term on the political side, you're in a career long, and a lot of people here, and they try and, I think it may not be overt, you often think about that. Who's looking after the long-term public good? You may have different answers, I don't know.
For me, that's an easy answer. She was. She was. And I recognize that, and I told her as much. And in my book, that there's an incident that will come out. I'll share it with you. I had occasion when I was leaving to say to the governor, because my chief officer told me what her sentiments were. And I said to the governor, listen, it would be a disservice to education if this lady leaves when I leave. There's going to be a gap from which we'll never recover. History has proven me correct. It's your responsibility as governor to persuade this officer not to retire. And by doing that, I was conceding that here's the permanence. Here is the link. I'm gone. She knew my agenda. She could serve the next minister by making that link. A politician couldn't make that link.
So do you agree with that?
Yes, I do agree with that.
How do you operationalize that when you're dealing with a political agenda that has to be served as well.
I'll tell you, I'll give you an example of how I dealt with it. I had a minister, not Mr. Bodden, obviously I wouldn't be telling the story. I had a minister that asked me to do something that I could not do.
Yeah.
I suppose it had been done in other cases. He actually wanted me to make a payment for a service that I didn't think it was worth that. And I said to him, I'm sorry, I cannot do it. And it went on for weeks and weeks. You're going to do this? No, I'm not going to do this. Well, I wouldn't say that he threatened me, but he was really winding kind of tight. And in the end, I went to the chief secretary and I said, will you please get this man off my back? I am not going to do this. And I'm very sorry to say, I won't tell you who the chief secretary was, but we had a very weak chief secretary, and he said, you're on your own. Good. Well, I remember going home that evening and saying, if this is the end of my job in government, this will be the end, but I'm not going to budge. Well, the minister found another way to do it. Not through me, I never did it. I found out about it weeks afterward. But I believe to this day, and I had an excellent relationship with that minister, and I believe to this day that he respected the stand that I took. He knew that he shouldn't have been doing that. He knew that. And he respected the stand. It never affected our relationship going forward for the many years we were together.
And sorry,
Yeah.
I know Gloria's got some questions she wants to pose too, but I'm just following a pathway here because, it's really about the integrity. And I suspect that concern that you or others may have is that if I bend to this wind, people will see that I'm bending to all, and where's the support I provide to my staff who are trying to do a good job?
You must remember that the civil service is quite different now. Following the 2009 constitutional changes and following the financial management system, which is another story, but following that system that put in a lot more checks and balances that we never had in those early days, in the early 2000s. Remember now, we did all the PR. I did all the PR for my ministry, wrote all the press releases, did all the HR, oversaw all the accounts. We had a financial officer, but I still had to oversee it and make sure that, we were doing our prop. So I think you have a lot more help, or now they have a lot more help than we had when I was there.
Oh, interesting.
Well, I was just going to say that, we talked about some of the times when the relationship is under strain and the perception is that, the minister could be interacting differently. But what about, and you two have been through some very difficult times. I recall that, the once-in-a-lifetime storm that we had here would have been during your tenure, and I recall you dealing with some very difficult legislation, modernizing our employment legislation, at a time where there were some very strong, critics out there coming from all quarters, perhaps, and maybe time will tell and the book will reveal, but perhaps even some from, friendly quarters. So that relationship can be, very important. How do you go about building that type of trust between you when you agree that there's a long-term goal that you're trying to accomplish, and that collaboration and that trust has to be so key? How do you go about making sure that relationship is able to do it, and you're both able to meet your respective positions, even when you may have had some setbacks that have occurred? How do you recover?
Well, if we take the labor legislation and what we were trying to do with employment as the example, first of all, I think that if we weren't on the same page, so to speak, we would not have achieved the success that we have achieved, even though the labor legislation went through the assembly and passed, but it wasn't assented to by the cabinet because I suppose it came too late. What was important is that Ms. Basdeo, as chief officer, and I sat down and we plotted with the other senior members in the ministry where we wanted labor to go. Because I realized that there were going to be pressures. What we were doing was nothing short of revolutionary. And I, as the minister, realized if I didn't have the support of my chief officer and all the other people in the ministry, that effort would have fallen flat. I would have been a political failure, and the country would have been much worse off. So my objective, first of all, was to gain the confidence and the support of my chief officer, because it was a battle we had to fight together. Every time something had, a statement had to be made, a press release had to be written, I wanted to be sure that my chief officer's heart was in it, that she could be behind me, propping me with the answers when I went to the public, because that was absolutely essential.
That's very interesting, and you talked about wanting to accomplish something that was so revolutionary. Mrs. Basdeo, as the permanent secretary, what did you really see as being, the bureaucracy's responsibility for creating and supporting that vision? What do you see the role of the civil service being?
To support the minister and to get his policies in place by doing things in a timely manner. I mean, we used to get a lot of criticism that the civil service was holding up X bill and so on and so forth. I want to speak to one thing, and that is and also I supported the labor bill. I had done my master's degree. That was my thesis on revolutionizing labor and linking it in with immigration, which I understand is coming. So I was 100% committed. But what do you do when you, as a chief officer, don't agree with the position that your minister has taken, and you're asked to write a paper in support? I'll give you a specific example. I won't forget this one. I was subbing in the Ministry of Tourism. You know who was there. And I was asked to write a paper so that dolphinariums would be introduced. Well, I don't believe in dolphins in captivity. I have never been to a dolphinarium. I'll never go. But it was my job, because the minister wanted it, to write the paper as to why we should have dolphinariums in Cayman. So I had to research it and do all this stuff. So sometimes you have to go against what your beliefs are, because who else was going to do it? So, but when you get something that you're passionate about, as I was always passionate about the whole labor and immigration thing, it becomes easy, because at the very beginning, the minister laid out what his agenda was. We had the agenda, we had the time frame, and we had the working relationship in place. And this is what I'll tell you. Mr. Bodden and I met probably every single day. If it was only for 10 minutes, usually it was early in the morning, if it was only for 10 minutes to talk about, this is what my day is going to be like, this is what my day is going to be like, this is a problem that we might see coming up, or so on and so forth. And that, the feeling, and I have to tell you, I became a principal secretary, they were called those days, in 1988. I was 37 years old. I'll never forget when the governor called me. He says, "Joy, you're going to be promoted." I said, "Really?" I was chief education officer at the time. I thought, oh, good, education. And I think it was Mr. Truman too. And he said, "No, you're going to go to health and social service with Ezard." And I thought, Jesus. Seriously, I have to tell you that it was probably one of the best 4 years of my entire life. I learned so much from an excellent minister, and I'll never forget what he said. The very first morning he came into the ministry, and he looked at me, and because I, of course, you know everybody there, you're your contemporaries. He said, "Joy, as long as you have my back, I'll have yours." And that was true. I learned so much from him as a minister, and we got big things in. We got the pensions bill, if you remember. We got the health insurance bill. Very, very big things. And what I have to say, the same thing for this minister, the same thing the very first day, and he said, "I have your back if you have mine." And that was it. We did, right?
Right?
Now, I have to say, I'm going to call you two on it. I've been married for many years. Michael will probably tell you 2 life sentences, right? So even in the best marriage, there come times when you've got difficult days. All the married people in here, do I get an amen? Amen. Bit too loud, I will be telling your spouses. So tell me, was there ever one of those moments that you were doing a serenity prayer, saying an amen? Is there any of those dolphinarium policies during the administration you had to contend with that your heart wasn't quite in it? Was there ever a time when there was a meeting and the civil service was heading off in one way and you needed to be with your constituents in another way? Like, what was the thing that sometimes meant you had to lean a little more in and remember that pledge that you made to each other on the first day?
I think the only time that I was disappointed in the reticence of my chief officer, but I didn't say anything to her about it.
I didn't hear it. This is new.
I didn't
She doesn't
say anything to
know.
her about it. Because I thought when I was trying to form the cadet corps that she was not as supportive as she should have been. Now, I got a lot of flack from a lot of quarters. And I said in my book, a journalist called me up and said, "What the hell do you think this is? The Congo in Africa that you're starting your private army?" So I realized that many people didn't know what a cadet corps was. And I was chuckling when you were talking about labor, because you know why I was so into the labor and realized that I had to have the support of my chief officer? You know, they always branded me a socialist, a leftist.
Yeah.
So when the labor legislation came out, yeah, that old socialist Roy Bodden bringing in this old labor law. So I said, boy, if I don't have my chief officer in on this, I am dead. I am dead.
Oh, God.
So I didn't make as much progress at the initial instance with the cadet corps as I thought I would have made. And I said, well, maybe my chief officer could have spurred us on a little. But I didn't say anything. I didn't take it personal. And this is the first time.
That's true.
Now she knows.
Shall I tell the story about the very first day?
Yeah, you can tell.
You have permission.
Well, Mr. Bodden was coming in for his first time as a minister. I'd been there a long time. I had a lot of experience in education, all this. But I was not very popular in government. And the government that was coming in, to be very honest, I think if they could have found some place to put me in a corner, they would have done so. You going to admit?
I didn't tell you. I didn't tell you the pressure that I got. I didn't tell you the pressure that I got.
I knew he was getting pressure, because I don't know how to do it now, but in those days there used to be a lot of horse trading, and the ministers would say, "Oh, I want this one, I want this PS, I want that PS," and so on. So I don't know if they foisted me off on you or whether you asked to me or what, but nevertheless.
Don't tell.
Nevertheless, when he came in, he was very stern, as if he was, a bit of laying down the law. And I looked at him and I said, Roy and I go back a long way because we're both from Bodden town. I looked at him and I said, let me tell you something. If Miss Sunshine could hear you now, she would turn over in her grave. That was his mother, who had passed away, who I knew very well because she was very good friends with my grandmother. But I think it was a shock to him that I would say that. Honestly. And then we said, let's start again.
It was.
And that is true. I honestly cannot tell you in 4 years. I cannot
No, we didn't.
In 4 years that we had a quarrel, a disagreement, or anything that I would go home and say, I really can't deal with this anymore. We had it was a very good working relationship, but the key is in the beginning, the very first day. You have to set the parameters for your relationship.
And I can say, as a politician, as the minister, any discussion of my chief officer was taboo in the caucus. I never allowed it. I never participated in it, and I never encouraged it. I said, a couple of times there was persistence. I said, listen, this is my relationship. And your business is, as I'm a minister and a part of this political directorate that I'm performing, you have no business at all in how I run my ministry and my relationship with my chief officer and the people of the ministry. You get your business done, and I'll get mine done. And that's it.
That's true.
I have another question, and Gloria, it's not on my list.
Yeah, I know.
I just thought about it because just the relationship that you're knowing each other and your the parents and things like that. I know when I went back to work in my hometown, it was a huge challenge because I knew everybody and they all knew me. And so when you start trying to bring rules into place and things like that, all of a sudden you could become the villain. So do you think it's an advantage or a disadvantage that, you know, you're in a smaller community, you know a lot of the people, performing your roles where you have that kind of intimacy, not only with the people you're working with, but the people you're serving, etc. Just curious, one is, you know, is that an advantage, disadvantage, or how do you manage that?
I thought about this when I was thinking what I would say. In many respects, it's an advantage because, you know, you say, well, we say in Cayman, you know who your mama is. Roy and I virtually grew up together in Bodden. I knew all about his, you know, his education. I knew the challenges that he had faced. I knew about his personal life. And that was good because in a way we had a pre-existing relationship. But it's like being in a goldfish and you live in the Cayman Islands. It's very, very difficult because, you know, you go to the supermarket and everybody knows and everybody's speculating about this, that, and the other and trying to get involved. So maybe in a bigger setting, it is perhaps a little bit easier.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Good point. Sir?
I thought what Joy said is true because her dad, and at the Bodden Town All Age School, was the headmaster, and I was a good student, and so.
Is that the stories you heard too?
And so there was that connection. But beyond that, I realized too that Joy and I came from Bodden Town. Our families knew each other, and that was all the more reason I said, this lady cannot be my enemy. Because I have to go back home.
Yeah.
I have to come to see all those people, including my mother, and all those people in Bodden Town. And so the relationship has to be professional. It has to be positive. And like I said, I realized from the very beginning that I couldn't be Joy. She was the chief officer, and she was the permanent link. And I was the politician, and I had my own role to play. So there was no kind of rivalry or graying of that area at all.
One of the questions that, you know, I really wanted to get into, because you both had a bit of an advantage by the time you got to work together. You had, you know, earned your political stripes, as it were. You'd been in Parliament for some time at that point. And Mrs. Basdeo, you'd been a permanent secretary for some point as well by the time you two got together. Sometimes we will have, either in the ministry itself or amongst some of the policy advisors coming from the departments, people who are newer to this arena and to that relationship. And I know that sometimes on the civil service side, we sometimes mistake, you know, or confuse political neutrality with political apathy, right? We just won't do anything political. That's someone else's side of things. And that can be, you know, fatal, I would imagine, to trying to get the type of revolutionary things done and fulfilling the minister's vision. How do you see that? Because I know you have studied all things about good governance, so you'll be able to certainly contribute to that discussion as well. But how do you really distinguish between that sort of the role of the civil servant in political neutrality, but not mistaking that for political apathy in the way that you go about your work?
Well, let me start by saying, there were no politics in our office. I didn't know who Joy supported, and I mean, she knew where I came from, and that never came into question, because when I came to the ministry. Everybody knows in Cayman, I have the reputation of being branded a leftist. But when I came into the ministry, that was the furthest thing from my mind. I never got that feeling that Joy was was one of those people who persisted in that. I think it was ideologically pure in the office. It was strictly business. And I certainly didn't ask her if she was supportive of my political directorate, because we had too many other things to do. I respected her individuality and her professional opinion, and politics kept out of it. Truth be known, I had enough time trying to survive among those politicians that I was in a group of.
Mrs. Basdeo, what's your take on that? I mean, what sort of political acuity do you really need to bring in order to get that done?
You know, can a chief officer really be political and neutral? I am not 100% sure, because my commitment was to whatever his policies were. And of course, they were the policies of the party, or whatever they were called at that point in time. So you can say, well, yeah, we existed in a silo, or I existed in a silo where I was really concentrated on that. But I don't think you could ever be political and neutral. You have to be committed to something. I was committed to him getting his stuff done, his work done.
I'm just curious, in your department you have lots of professionals.
Right.
They may not have that same kind of attitude. They may be, well, you know, I've done all this education, I have this experience, and my recommendation is we should do this, but it doesn't fit into that political agenda. How do you explain that to your staff? That
just tell it to them straight. That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. Because you know, there were times when I didn't agree with my heads of department. There were many times I didn't agree. But in the end, I felt that I had to answer to him for his policies, and therefore you get back what for the better good. You know, you might have an idea. I might think it's too expensive. It's too many catches. It's too many. But in the end, the buck stops. The buck stops with the minister, and your job is to support him. I mean, the other big thing is what happens when you get a minister that you do not like. You know, seriously.
I'm sure that's never happened, right?
Oh, that happened to me. Oh, that has certainly happened to me. Yeah, when you get a minister that you don't like, what do?
What do you do? That's an excellent question.
Well, I was about to resign, retire. No, it can be very difficult, and I mean it is a difficult job. There is no, you know. Sometimes I look at my son, who you know is the chief officer, and I think, yeah, you're feeling it. It is a difficult job. But I'll tell you what, I remember when I became principal secretary in 1988, and I basically had a conversation with myself. And I said, well, these are the things that I'm going to do, and these are the things that I am not prepared to do. And I kept that. I knew where I was going. Of course, it helps when you have a lot of confidence in yourself. That helps. But, you know, I always say, as a mother and as a wife, you have to take care of yourself first. Because if you don't take care of yourself and your needs, you cannot take care of anything else, and you cannot do a good job. So at the end of my career, I realized I have to take care of myself. I was not well. That was the chief reason why I retired at 53. I realized I had to take care of myself. But if I had not planned to retire and retired, I would probably have left, because I found it very, very difficult in the situation I found myself in the last few months with a new government and a new minister.
Well, it's interesting because over the last day and a half, we've actually broached that topic several times about the authentic you. You have to be yourself.
Yeah.
And you also, in terms of leadership, because we're talking to a group of leaders here, you have to be comfortable with the kind of leader you want to be, right? The approach you take and things like that. So the other thing that we've been talking about over the last day and a half is also about innovation and creativity, that it's a time when there's so many things happening around the world. Technology is advancing, the globe is getting smaller, etc. And so there's increased pressure for this group and others out there to be more innovative and creative. But that's within an environment that's often described as being risk adverse, right? Don't have a failure because it'll be on the front page of the news, or it'll be in the radio or TV, or et cetera. So what's your advice about that kind of dynamic? That how can you be creative at the same time and take some chances in an environment that says, we can't afford to fail because it hits the papers? And this is just advice, by the way, right?
You want to speak to that?
Yeah, I want to speak to that because from the outside, often you hear about what we in sociology call the bureaucracy, that the bureaucracy is stagnant, that they are slow to embrace change, that they're not technologically savvy, and that they're accustomed to civil service is accustomed to doing things the same way for the last 500 years. And so there's what they're being left behind. So my advice, you have to analyze the situation you're in. And the first thing I would do is try to, what if it doesn't go right? Mitigate disaster. Mitigate disaster. Temper any collateral damage. Balancing that with the urge, the necessity to be creative, to be innovative, and to lead. And to lead. But if you were to sit down and concentrate only and ask yourself, what if it fails? You'd never get anything done. And I always tell people under me, look, nobody is going to hang you for an honest mistake. But you have to understand, in the bureaucracy, it must be an honest mistake. There can be no graying of the area. It can't be anything that is tinctured with an element of corruption, an element of self-interest, an element of dishonesty. So if you set out to be innovative and you make a mistake because of a miscalculation, nope, that shouldn't cost you your career. It shouldn't even cost you a promotion.
I think you also have to have a plan B. I'm serious. In the situation when I was saying that I was asked to do something that I could not do, I went home and actually, because I'm a planner, that's what I do. That's my training as a planner. Change management, that sort of thing. But I did have a plan B, that if the chief secretary came to me the next day and said, sorry, Joy, but you know, this is it. This is the end of the line, or are we going to put you in a corner someplace? What was I going to do? I had a plan B. And that is very important. You cannot put in any career, you cannot put all your eggs in one basket. And it means looking out for yourself. Keeping your, what they call it now, your toolkit. Making sure that you're not stagnating, making sure that you're reading, making sure that you're doing courses, making sure that you're keeping up with your career in the different areas of your career. I mean, I think there's a lot, maybe, I don't know, but maybe there's less of that going on than what was going on when we were there, because the civil service was very much smaller. But you always have to say, what if? What if something happens? What if there's downsizing? What if whatever? What if there's a minister that hates me? What am I going to do then? So you have to think about that, and it goes right back to being your authentic self and knowing yourself and making sure that you have a plan, making sure that this is what I will do and this is what I will not do.
And that your plan, that your roadmap is transparent. Mm-hmm. And it's transparent for all to see. Yes.
So question for you, and then we're going to throw it to the audience. Yeah. But Mr. Bodden, you've been on all sides of, political or public service, civil servant, politician, and now public servant in a statutory authority leading the university college. What would you say has been the more challenging way to contribute, and why would you say that? Having been on all sides of this equation.
Well, I think for me, it's a sense of realizing that I am a servant. I'm a servant. And that I must, as a servant, I must be humble. I must make myself available. And I must be honest in the advice that I dispense. And you know, I am kind of like unique and different. I told you I got my groundings. I went to the oldest teachers' college in the Western Hemisphere and the second oldest in the world. It was a college steeped in slavery because it was founded to educate the children of slaves. And so all of us who attended that, and by the way, Joy's father attended that college as well. Mm-hmm. All of us who attended that college came from that college with a sense of service, a sense of humility, and a sense that we were advantaged, and a sense of self. So I think for me, I have always remained grounded because I never lost sight of that. I never lost sight of that. And it's my ambition in everything that I've tried. I have to give something back. Mm-hmm. I have to give something back. I have to be humble. I don't know it all. I should always be willing to learn. Open.
Thank you. So we're going to put it to the, yeah. Are there any questions? I'm not sure. Sue's hand went bolting up, so this I've got to hear, just in the middle. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you both very much. I would have said I do to Mr. Bodden when I was a senior civil servant in the UK, and it's clear to see that the two of you are the epitome of everything that you'd want in a politician and an officer. And that confidence, but humility comes through from both of you. My background is more in the UK, and I'm newish to Cayman and privileged to be here. And the thing I love about the Cayman politicians is they're not career politicians. So I look at the Cayman politicians and they've had a life before politics, and politics is usually alongside that life. And so there's a greater understanding of what it takes to make things happen and what's realistic and what's reasonable and what's not. My question, though, is the same of politicians, I think, pretty much around the world. That you've got in the chief officer cadre a group of people that have been trained and developed and experienced over time, that have got to where they've got to because they've proven themselves. Whereas a politician, as we all know, can be elected having had no prior experience, and then they're just sort of catapulted into the most sort of senior roles. And you know, usually, I mean, I've worked for ministers that are new politicians in the UK, so not even had backbench experience. So my question is, and again, I'm sure it's not true in Cayman, but I know it's certainly true of some in the UK, but we have over 600. You do get politicians that aren't as humble as you, that aren't as respectful or as willing to listen as perhaps you are, Mr. Bodden. So my question to both of you is, given you can have politicians and ministers coming in with relatively little experience, but very, very big ideas and big plans, how would you advise a senior officer to navigate the course with a politician that's a sort of conceptual thinker, that's got a really strong sort of view to do something, but which is really, really difficult, impractical, unaffordable, or whatever? How do you manage that relationship with somebody that perhaps is less humble and less willing to listen? Thank you.
Well, I'll answer that. I have felt for a very long time that politicians, particularly ministers coming into the cabinet, need, in fact, I'm sure I have the papers or it's someplace, need some sort of, and maybe you have it, I don't know, orientation, training, or whatever. But that is going to happen. You're going to get politicians that are going to come in with probably not, maybe no more than a high school education. You're going to get that, and they're going to be in. The responsibility for that has to be on the chief officer and their senior advisors. And also, I think that there needs to be, if you don't have it now, and the Canadian people have a lot of good material on this. I remember looking at some of it. There needs to be training, specific training for chief officers. And I'm not talking about importing any system or course or anything. It needs to be tailored to our particular situation in the Cayman Islands, because it is your responsibility. You have to be a teacher in that situation. You have to understand how to guide your politician, and they're not likely to be humble. You know, they like to be pushing their way through, and you know, you have to be careful because they might also push you out. I mean, we have seen some things like that going on here from the little bit that I hear. But it goes right back to the chief officer being confident in yourself, being confident in your ability, knowing your stuff, sharpening your toolbox. And I'll tell you one more thing that I'm saying for a chief officer, and you can't take the place of this. You need a mentor. You need a mentor. You need somebody that you can go to when things are rough. We weren't so lucky in terms of having a mentor, and to be very honest, as a group of chief officers, they weren't that supportive either. But if you can find somebody just to sound off and talk to, you're going to be well ahead. I was very fortunate that my father had been a permanent secretary for many years, and so he was always my sounding board that I could go to and know that I was talking in confidence and say that this is a situation. But there are people out there that you can talk to. You can find people that you can talk to just to listen to what you're saying, because you have to be careful not to get lost in that politics, not to get lost in who likes you or who's trying to bring you down or who's competing against you. You have to steer your own course. Steer your course. Know what you stand for, and that is the main thing. Know what you stand for, what you're prepared to do, what you're not prepared to do, and know your job, know your role. And the role, every time you get a chief officer and the deputy chief officers or whatever, they need to have some type of training to understand their role. Because it's not like it used to be when you would have people promoted who, had very little education or whatever. I'm sure all you now have first degrees, second degrees, all sort of management training and so on. But that role, the role of a chief officer, is very, very important. And it changes. It changed in 2009. I don't even understand now what your role is completely. So that's my advice. Get a mentor.
And from the political perspective, I think that I reflect upon this. I think in my case, what helped me, because I was for so many years on the backbench, I had a humility. I brought a humility with me that was uncharacteristic in people, in persons who shortly after they got elected or elevated to ministerial positions. Also in my case, it helped. I used to tell myself, hey, when I heard my colleagues talking and brag, I said, don't worry, you have other currency in your pocket, so if you fail politically, you're not a failure. You don't have to do things, you don't have to ride roughshod over people to get political success, because you have an alternative. So maybe the persons who come in and don't have an alternative, they have to do that. So I always took into consideration the human element. And always asked, I wouldn't want that done to me, so I wouldn't do it to anyone. And I've studied it, and I talk about this in my book that's soon to be published. That one of the qualities that's lacking among successful politicians is that they're not very humble. They're not very humble. There's an air of arrogance, and I suppose political success the world over brings this. I mean, you don't want any more than President Donald Trump. Believe that, look, it has to be my way. It has to be my way. And I was also cognizant. It wasn't until my later life that I shook the business of the empire. I was always very cognizant of the civil service being an almost sacred institution, that you have to be careful as a politician to maintain its values and not to pollute or contaminate it with political aspirations. And Joy was right. I call it the politicization of the civil service, where politicians try to co-opt their chief officers and their permanent secretaries. I never did that. I stayed away from that. I was confident that my ideas could make it on their own. They had merit on their own. And I was always very careful to keep the respectful difference between chief officer and politician.
Thank you. Another? We'll take two more, and I think we're going to be out of time.
Thank you both for sharing and your insights. I think everybody's just enjoying it so much. And I look forward to your book, Mr. Bodden. I hope there's going to be some revelations in there. But my question is to Joy. As Chief Officer or Permanent Secretary, you have basically two bosses. You have the Minister, but you have the Chief Secretary, or now the Deputy Governor. How did you balance those two relationships?
Well, yes, that's how it's supposed to be. That's how it's supposed to be. In truth and in fact, it really didn't happen that way. I guess I got called in a couple of times for the you never guess what one of them was about. One of them was about smoking. I don't smoke anymore. But the chief secretary and his role was really not clearly defined in our times. To be very honest, the role of the minister was much clearer in my mind than the role of the chief secretary. And so, to be very honest, I think I sort of skirted around the chief secretary. I never really saw him as my boss. I guess he might have been my boss, but I really never saw him as my boss. But now you have a deputy governor, maybe it's a whole different situation. I don't know.
I'd recommend a different perspective by the people in this room. I think we got time for one more.
Just behind you. Just
behind you.
Thank you very much, I'm Roy and Joy. My question is, as you transition, I'm talking not necessarily the chief officer or the political role, but the actual broader staff. As they transition to a kind of a new minister and a new set of expectations, priorities and values, is the chief officer the sort of strict gatekeeper? Or, I mean, in this conference we've been talking about not such a top-down leadership, of more sort of encouraging innovation and, those sorts of things. Does the politician meet with the broader staff, or does it all go through the chief officer in terms of, trying to put your program?
I don't think so. I think Amy can tell you she was there, but I think, I think mostly the staff came through me in terms of, I'm not saying they didn't talk to the minister, because the minister and I both had an open door policy. I do remember, I'll tell you a story. I do remember, and I think this person came and talked to you. I had someone who came and talked to me one day and told me that she thought that I was playing favorites. And I said, oh, really? And she says, yeah, we just got a new assistant secretary, and in the morning, as soon as you come in, you go straight to her desk and say good morning to her. I said, well, did you notice the coffee machine was next to her desk? But no, I really did have a policy. But you see, you have to be very, very careful, particularly in the early days, because your staff, at least that's what I found out, your staff would try and get in with the minister. They would, that's human nature. They would try and make themselves known to the minister, and so the minister could appreciate what they were doing and so on, and that's fine. I didn't have any problem with that. But where work was concerned, ideas and so on and so forth, I needed to come through me, because I think I had a wider perspective than some of my, what you call them now, analysts or whatever they're called. But we call them assistant secretaries and so on, and they had different responsibilities. So, you know, I am a big believer in participative management, but I also had to protect the minister, his time and so on, from people sometimes who wanted to, you know, make their own case heard. But you did not interfere with staff, and I do remember that 100%.
I didn't.
You didn't interfere with that.
I would just add that even from the Canadian context, I've been in similar situations, and it's also about protecting the staff. Because I've had situations where staff, eager, went to the minister's staff, actually in Canada it's a little bit different, and gave the wrong advice.
Yes.
And now I'm not in a position to provide protection, right? Because it's a one, and then all of a sudden it was, I want that person gone.
Yeah.
Literally like that, so.
All that.
Yeah, a challenge.
So you have a question?
Yeah. I
think one more.
It's going to be very quick. I'm sorry, we are running out of time.
Is the informal process, and maybe not but within Cayman, and excuse my naivety, when there is a lack of trust in the minister, that the minister can be moved on through the chief officer? Is I know back home, where they're normally fed to the media, and the media will try and shift them on to a different department. Can that happen within Cayman?
The minister, to move the minister?
Move the minister.
Chief officer? No.
For example, as the lady behind said, if they know nothing about the industry or the sector, can we...
No, you're stuck.
The people...
The chief officer then has to assume the leadership role, and if the minister is smart, he or she will submit to that, as frequently happens here. I don't want to call names, but people say, well, you know.
And what I would just add to that is, you know, getting back to roles and responsibilities. I mean, ultimately, the responsibility for the chief officer side of the equation rests with the deputy governor. And ultimately, the person responsible for the ministerial side of the equation rests with the premier. And, you know, heavy are both heads.
Yes.
There's very significant responsibilities there. But we have to respect, you know, the processes by which both parties got to the position that they're in.
Definitely, you also have to work with the people, minister as well as chief officer. And if the chief officer believes that the minister is not rightly doing their job properly, can they?
No, unless it's something to do with corruption, something illegal. That's the only recourse. But if someone is a dodo, nah. But you have to live with that.
And you got to remember, there are report cards on either side, and ultimately the report card for ministers happen at the polls, right? So we got to respect the place that feedback is given and the way that people get there. And they're both arduous journeys to get there. They're both difficult tasks. So I noticed that in all the questions, we've had a lot of candor, but when I asked Mr. Bodden which one was more difficult, being a minister or being a public servant, he went all around that one. So I have to believe,
I
have to believe it's a toss-up. They're both pretty hard, and I guess it depends on the day.
I didn't want to say this, but you pumped it out of me. Under the public authorities law, there is no way I would want to be hanging around too long. I think that's probably one of the things that led me decide to retire from the University College. Draconian.
So it seems we won. We have the harder jobs. He said so.
Yes.
It's hard.
Yes.
I just want to say thank you to the both of you. It was really refreshing to have this type of candor between the two of you. We bring in persons to take the stage. You know, sometimes we need to bring them from overseas to really be able to speak to truth, the types of things that we're saying. And sometimes we need them to have a little arm's length from our political and public service realities. And I just want to say you did not disappoint. It was truly refreshing to hear from both of your perspectives. I certainly learned a lot. I thought I knew how some things operated, but I see there was even a story behind what I thought I understood about it. So thank you both so very much for sharing of your time. I too am looking forward to the book that's coming out in the fall, the spring. And I just wanted to say, Mrs. Basdeo, that we really appreciate it. And I love the way you both began. I have to tell you that if every union went that smoothly, we would be, you know, beating people away who are lining up to be public servants and to be ministers. Our future would be secure. So you've certainly set the tone that we can all try to establish in our relationships, dare say, not just in the office, but if we had that type of harmony even at home, things would be perfect. So thank you both so very much. And I wanted to share a small token of our appreciation.
Thank you. Thank you.
That is very nice. Thank
very
you.
nice.
Goodies.
Very nice of you. Very nice of you. Very nice.
Again. And thank you. You've been a wonderful office.